Um, Good evening, everyone. It's great to see so many people here on a rainy day. We are really delighted at the Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute to have our second speaker in a series on environmental justice and Indigenous rights. I guess, Erica Weinthal. I'm one of the co-directors of the Human Rights Center here. And Emily is in the back, Emily Stewart, who is our assistant director of the Human Rights Center. So this evening, we have Andrew Curley, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at UNC, who is going to speak on what is a resource curse, which I am presuming is very different than how we in political science sometimes talk about the resource curse. But he will be speaking on energy infrastructure, colonialism, and climate change in Native North America. Overall, he studies coal and development in the Navajo Nation and has published extensively on colonial water laws on Indigenous nations and the political economy of green transition within reservation economies. I want to point out an article that I was very excited about when that he has an article that he published on Winter's Rights, Challenging Colonial Water Laws, that came out in a journal that I edit in the journal Global Environmental Politics in 2019. It's also part of a special issue on Indigenous water law and Indigenous water politics that came out of a collaboration out of the University of British Columbia on decolonizing water. And the last thing I want to note is I think Andrew is going to say a few words on the land acknowledgement, but just note that at the Human Rights Center, we have a group right now, and Emily can also talk more about it, of students and faculty and members from different tribes, from different universities, from NC State, working on pulling together a land acknowledgement for the Human Rights Center and also for Duke more broadly. And that is a work in process, and hopefully, I don't know by when, we will have something that we can use at all of our events. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Duke Human Rights Center, for inviting me to speak on some of my research and some of the points on the colonialism of indigenous country that we all face. First, we want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the Saponi people and the Tuolani people, if I'm saying that correctly, and that these are unceded territories in which people lived and built their lives and had generations of kinship networks that were violently displaced by the colonization of North Carolina. And we also have, but we still have indigenous nations living here today. The Lumbee, Eastern Band Cherokee, Saponi, different Saponi nations here within the region, and then also extensively throughout the state. So we should be mindful of whose lands that we're on and the territories that they are contesting, from the state and from the federal government. So with that, let's talk about colonialism in the Southwest. So the title of my presentation, What is a Resource Curse, actually does dig at the political science literature and the development economics literature on the idea of resource curse for its naivety, in that the explanation for the curse is often about priorities in development, priorities by the state governments, and not so much taking into account the historical linkages between these nations and their colonial overseers, what Nkrumah called neocolonialism. And in post-colonial contexts and when settler colonial contexts like what we're in today in Native North America, we're talking about continued colonialism, colonialism that is unending, that hasn't ended. And so that's what this title of this presentation is trying to reference and trying to get at. And in order to understand how contemporary colonialism manifests, how enclosures and resource underdevelopment and certain kinds of exploitation are occurring, I wanted to focus on a couple things, and that's energy development, infrastructure, resources, and climate change and how all of those things are intermixed. And we have limited time, so I'm going to try to get through it as quick as possible. A good place to start is to take a look at this news headline from 2017, where Indigenous leaders were meeting with President Trump on expanding, on negotiating, and trying to lobby the federal government to expand rights towards resource exploitation and development. And so the question is, what historical forces, what contemporary structuring forces brought tribal leaders to this point where they're negotiating with somebody who proudly hangs a picture of Andrew Jackson in the White House and is one of the most anti-Indian presidents that we've seen in recent memory, and what is bringing tribal leaders to the table and trying to negotiate with the federal government and expanding these authorities are structuring forces of colonialism, the way in which federal Indian law incentivizes certain kinds of practices within reservation, namely resource extraction and exploitation, and the limitations of those authorities that are placed around tribes. And so I'm going to try to articulate what that looks like, especially for the Navajo Nation, where I've done most of my research. And then I think that this question that we have when we see tribal leaders and the federal government interacting in this way, it brings certain more questions, additional questions to what we're thinking about with climate change. And contemporaneous to what was happening here in the previous slide to was the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change press release. This was actually the following fall, in the fall of 2018, where they released an alarming report. It wasn't really a report, but it was a statement saying that in order for the world governments and community to avoid some of the worst impacts of climate change, to avoid going over 1.5 degrees centigrade in terms of warming of the planet, the world community had to, and I highlighted the phrase that I thought was really interesting, they would have to do rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. So the question becomes, when we're looking at that previous slide and we're seeing Indigenous people interacting with the federal government under these kind of colonial relationships, what does rapid, far-reaching, unprecedented changes in all aspects of society look like? You know, for colonized people, for people in Canada, for people in the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and other settler colonial societies. In order to understand this, I'm trying to think through a couple of concepts to give me some sort of language to describe what's going on. And these are ideas of resource sovereignty, and that's the way in which Indigenous nations, Indigenous tribal leaders within recognized tribal governments, and we'll talk about the history of those governments, how they are thinking about their powers or authorities in developing these resources, things that they see beneath the subsurface of their lands. And so I'm suggesting that these are ontological interventions. They're a way to shape how Indigenous people are seeing the land, the water, the air in today's case, and they're changing it to conform with the way in which resources are understood under federal law and under federal policy. So it's a shift in the way people are seeing the environment and changing our environmental governance, in effect. Resources also shape the way we think about territory and sovereignty, and the kinds of spaces that we're producing within our communities and reservations. And so the main point is that resources are shaped by federal Indian policy, and they lead to new understandings of these concepts, territory, sovereignty, and then anticipates how we might respond to climate change. And I've seen these on the ground. I've talked to tribal leaders and how they've tried to avoid these questions of climate change in order to continue in the kinds of development practices that have been in the works for the last 50, 60 years in some cases. And so that's how we're trying to pit the idea of resource curse and sovereignty together to try to get a sense of how these things are playing out. And then next, this is where my most recent research is moving, and the direction it's moving is to focus on infrastructures. And so resources alone don't explain these things. You know, we can't have like a resource fetish or just think that resources in and of themselves and where they are can do the work of understanding what tribal governments are doing and how the federal government is bringing and conscripting tribes into development policies, regional development policies, and national development policies that involve resources and energy. And so what I found in doing historical research and some archival research in Arizona is that the infrastructures are what's key to putting resources into motion. So they are what allow for these colonial structures to reproduce over time. And I'm arguing now that over the period between the mid-1960s to 2019, they exacerbate material difference in terms of wealth and political political strength. I say that the tribes are marginalized through the ways in which infrastructures have been built throughout the region. And so consequently, when infrastructures have had a life cycle to exist for in the case of the infrastructures that I'm looking at in this presentation, the Central Arizona Project and Navajo Generating Station, when they've had the life cycle that they've had, they've exacerbated a political difference between the state of Arizona and the Navajo Nation in this case, especially over the issue of water rights. And so I'm going to try to show how that all works together. One thing to note is that when we're thinking about resources and we're thinking about how resources get mobilized through infrastructures and on indigenous lands, that these things have always been in a state of transition. So we're talking a lot discursively about this idea of transition, about the Green New Deal, and about moving from fossil fuel energy bases to green energy bases. And when I look at the tribal council meetings minutes from the 1960s, in the Navajo Nation, when the Navajo Nation Tribal Council was making decisions on these issues, they were thinking about them in motion and in transition. So when we signed coal leases specifically in 1965 and 1966, we were doing them with the understanding that nuclear power would supplant coal as a dominant form of energy production in the United States. So there was this anticipation that nuclear would make coal obsolete within the next few years. And so we were going to exploit these coal resources in order to take advantage of them while we had the opportunity. As it turns out, coal lasted much longer. It lasted until 2019 in the case that I'm looking at within the Navajo Generating Station in Kayenta coal mine. And subsequently, we've had people develop senses of identity, livelihood, and these industries became embedded within the community and within the political landscape of the Navajo Nation. And those are things we didn't anticipate when we signed these contracts in the mid-1960s. So these are things that are important that we need to recognize now, especially when we have this idea of new technologies supplanting older technologies in this kind of teleology towards like modernization and progress that we are anticipating with sustainable energy technology. That is part of the political discourse today. So the main points of the presentation are energy infrastructures, including the use and mobilization of resources, are what Osage scholar Jean Dennison calls colonial entanglements. And she uses this as a metaphor to get us to think about how the governance, the politics of a nation, and the resources on which they're reliant become bound together, and they're hard to dislodge. And so when you're talking about transition, we're talking about moving beyond coal again, those are things that will create friction, they'll create tension, and they'll create difficulty to pull them apart if you think about how like things get knotted up. And that's why she uses that idea of entanglement. Those things they become difficult to undo. And then secondly, infrastructures become temporally colonial beachheads. So one builds off of the advances of the next in order to ensnare indigenous peoples into colonial logics, colonial systems of environmental governance, and understandings of environments like water, like land, like resources, in order to get them to be consistent with the way development is being envisioned in certain regions, especially in the Southwest, where water is key to development, to creating major metropolises like Phoenix, and smaller cities like Tucson, but mainly like Phoenix, Los Angeles, and Las Vegas. So let's look at some maps. Since I'm coming from a geography department, this is a map you might not see a lot when you're thinking about the United States. This is a map of federally recognized tribes. And as you can see, a lot of the tribes with the larger land bases are found in the western half of the United States. It's claimed as the United States. And, this kind of follows the way in which U.S. imperialism moved westward in kinds of arrangements that they made with new nations that they encountered when they came into the territories, like what was once New Mexico territory, now both Arizona and New Mexico, and some of in the nations in the Great Plains. And so the historical phenomenon that we need to notice is that these larger land-based tribes, and that's kind of an official terminology that nations like the Navajo Nation, like the Crow, like Standing Rock and Pine Ridge, they use these to reference how much land that is under their control. Although the title is still maintained by the federal government, but we have certain kinds of authorities within these lands, and so these are called large land-based tribes, and they're in the Mountain West and the Plains area, and you can see how that is distributed across that part of the United States. What we find is that's also where there's a lot of coal, oil, natural gas, a lot of the resources that are the foundation for fossil fuel extraction. And so this is information coming from the Energy Information Agency, and this is where the known coal fields exist. And so I'll show you exactly how that overlays with reservation boundaries. And so you can see that there's direct overlap. In the case of Navajo Nation, where I'm looking, there's a coal bed here and then on the eastern end. And then those circles with triangles are power plants. So where the power plants have been built, they're coal power plants. So where the power plants are built, they're usually built near the site of extraction. Coal is one of these industries that you have to convert the coal into energy nearer to the site of extraction because it's just such a difficult thing to move across space as opposed to oil and natural gas and other kinds of fossil fuels. So the two fossil fuel areas that I looked at, this was a Navajo generating station here on this part of the map, and that was a Kayenta mine. And this is where I did my research between 2012 and 2014, and I'll show some of the findings of that shortly. And just to give you an idea, this is how oil and gas overlay with reservations as well. One thing I wanted to point out is that the development of energy in Indian country is done unevenly, and it happens at the same time, but with different kinds of effects. And what I mean is, we have boom and bust cycles at work. We saw in 2016 the kinds of pressures that oil infrastructure, with the Dakota Access Pipeline, with the moving and building a crude oil pipeline across the Missouri River and near the Standing Rock Reservation and on the homelands of the Standing Rock people that were unceded territories that have since been taken into private control. Like that, you saw the pressure that generated and the kinds of mobilizations and the Indian activism that resisted it, and that was like due to this boom in oil and fracking and natural gas that has occurred over the last 10 years with this transition in energy from certain kinds of fossil fuels to natural gas that we've been hearing about. That's was part of Obama's all of the above energy approach in 2012 when he was running for president, and was also part of Bush's energy approach in the second half of his second administration. So those policies went into effect in the mid-2000s to the late 2000s, and then they started to become realities for Indigenous nations, especially in the plains and in places like North Dakota and South Dakota, where a lot of fracking is occurring. But there's also some of that happening in the Navajo Nation on the eastern end of the reservation. So this is represented in this statistic here, where the number of lease oil lease production that was done on Indian land, which is also considered federal land, went up by 22% over between 20 in 2014. Whereas coal, where I did my research, that's why I highlight it here, went down 1.6% on Indian land, and much of that's on the Navajo Nation. So that's telling you that you're having different kinds of impacts on Indian country. You're having these kind of pressures from the development of oil infrastructure, and then you're having like this busted industry where people are being laid off from their jobs that they've been employed in for in some cases more than 30 years, where suddenly people's incomes dry up and there's no more work. And so because of the way that energy and resources have played out across Indian country over the last 50 years, you have people that are in a precarious position and are experiencing the worst impacts of energy transition. And it's not a new thing. It's a long-standing phenomenon. So that's something that I thought we ought to acknowledge. In order to understand specifically how the Navajo Nation was conscripted into this energy resource curse nexus, we have to think historically about what the Navajo Nation was doing in the 1960s and how it got involved in the development project of Arizona during that time. So I'm going to talk a little bit of, I'm going to say some bad things about Arizona for all you Arizona nationalists that happen to be here. I think that's a big size of my crowd here. So Arizona nationalists, they thought they were going to get some red meat here. No, it's not going to happen. This is another map that I think also like reflects some of the impacts over time of resource extraction on the Navajo Nation. This is coming from Dana Powell's book. She is an anthropologist who's at Appalachian State and wrote this book called Landscapes of Power. Oh, no, it's called Power. Oh, I have the citation at the end of this presentation, so sorry, Dana, I'm forgetting your title of your book. But it's a great map because it shows the history of certain kinds of extraction. Like here's where uranium first was being extracted in the Navajo Nation. So that's what these circles are, and then the mine that I pointed out earlier is right here, the Kayenta mine in the Navajo Generating Station. And so that's where coal has since replaced parts of the uranium industry that closed down in the 1960s, 70s, and eventually the last ones closed down in the 80s. But I'm not talking about uranium here, even though that's something that we could also go into detail about. What I want to focus on is the construction of the Central Arizona Project, because often we don't associate this with coal in the Navajo Nation. But what I come to learn is that the Navajo Generating Station, that power plant that is in this previous slide right here in the upper left-hand corner, that was built in order to power the water from Cap to going into Phoenix. So it was necessary for Phoenix to develop. And the reason why Navajo Generating Station was built was because the proposed hydroelectric dams that the Bureau of Reclamation and the Department of Interior under Stuart Udall wanted to build in the 1960s, like 1964 is when these proposals were being drafted. They were staunchly opposed by environmental groups at the time, specifically the Sierra Club, who initiated one of the first environmental movement mobilizations that set precedents for now how environmental mobilizations occur today by buying a full-page ad in the New York Times saying, condemning some of these dam proposals that were going to bring energy from the Colorado River to move Colorado River water up and around these mountains down into the Salt River Valley where Phoenix is, and that would partially flood parts of the Grand Canyon. And they said flooding the Grand Canyon is like flooding the Sistine Chapel in Rome. And so, they were making those kinds of analogies, saying that these are places that are part of the heritage of America, and America that they envisioned was not including indigenous peoples, and that what the federal government ought to do is something different, and they should move away from hydroelectric dams. And they encourage their membership to write in to Secretary Udall and tell him to oppose the dam projects. And so this was one of the first successful environmental movement campaigns. And what they ended up doing was proposing a coal-fired power plant, as it turns out. And now we're thinking about the costs of coal and carbon emissions, especially with climate change, but at the time, that was the environmental solution. So again, it puts things into perspective when we're thinking about solutions to our energy crisis. And so we moved from, these are maps that were coming from Udall's papers at University of Arizona. And we moved from the proposed dam to, I'm sorry, I don't know why I didn't just flip that open, but you can see there's a thermal power plant that's hidden underneath half of that page. But there was a conceptual movement from this kind of infrastructure to that kind of infrastructure that required Navajo coal and Navajo Nation participation in order for it to happen. And the state of Arizona would not be able to get that water to Phoenix and to Tucson without the Navajo Nation being part of it. And part of the lease contract that the Navajo Nation signed in 1969 was to put a 50-year pause on any kind of water rights that they were going to claim from the upper basin of the Colorado River, which I'll explain in a moment. But that was sacrificing Navajo water rights in order for Phoenix and Tucson to develop. And that's creating these colonial inequalities, these material differences, as I was referencing earlier. And so this starts in the 1960s. And you can see, here's some more plans, but you can see how this was received in the Navajo Nation. And this was the origin of our coal economy at that time. And then it was sold to us as development, as jobs, as modernization, as bringing revenues to the tribal government. You had maps about how they were planning on, building a mine and also the power plant and what that all would do. And as it turned out, it was serving a larger purpose beyond just what was being highlighted in the Navajo Times at the time. And like I said, there was a water component to the story. And the thing that a lot of people don't know about Western water law, and I talk about in this article that was referenced earlier, is that it's a first in use, first in right, the quantification of water. And the water law is structured in such a way that it's incentivizing people who have rights to use them all, otherwise they lose them. And so it doesn't have any environmental outcomes in mind. It's actually creating exploitation of these water sources and trying to get people to use them all up. That was the thinking at the time in the late 19th century when these laws went into place, into the early 20th century. But they didn't have sustainability as a purpose. And so anyway, so the way that the Colorado River was divided in 1922 through the Colorado Compact was to artificially divide it at a place called Lee's Ferry, right on the edge of the Navajo Nation, and say anything north of here is upper basin upper basin Colorado River, and anything south of it is the lower basin Colorado River. And the states with some sort of interest in that river would then allocate their rights, the total acre feet of water that they get from that river based on where they sit on the upper or lower basin. And so in 1922, there was an overestimation. It's long been documented that, the hydrologists at the time were not factoring in, I guess, cyclical understandings of water supplies. And so consequently, they thought 15 million, they estimated the Colorado River annually had 15 million acre feet of water that went through it a year. And that's not true. And now with climate change, it's even less. There's even less water that's coming through the Colorado River. But consequently, all of the rights have been divided based on that 15 million acre feet estimate. And so the whole thing has been divided up by the states, excluding the interests of indigenous nations and their access to water. So in that Colorado Compact, it says nothing in this agreement will impact Indian water rights or pertains to Indian water rights, which was a way of avoiding Indian water rights, which was also another way of taking all the water without giving Indian water to Indian tribes. And so now, because of that compact and the way it was worded and subsequent laws and diversions that have been, diversions being like infrastructure, dams, small and large, like we're seeing on the Colorado, like the Glen Canyon Dam or the Hoover Dam, those are all subsequently like built on this division of the Colorado River. And now we have to go to the states in order to get our water. Indigenous nations who've been using these waters forever are now subject to the authority of the state. And they're using that as a leverage to get us to do things. Like just recently, we saw in the headlines of the Arizona Republic that the state of Arizona will not sign a casino compact with the Navajo Nation until we settle our water claims with the state of Arizona. So they're using that as a way to get us to reduce our claims and to be part of their division and agreeing to the logic of their quantification of water across the Southwest. So that's giving you a sense of how that works. And this has been a policy that's developed over time, the way in which these resources have been seen and implemented. And in order to understand that, I created this table that gives you a historical look at the federal Indian law that has created the constriction and created the limitations of what tribes can do, but also how the incentives that were being placed around tribes to get them to do certain things with their resources at the same time. So often when we talk in Native American studies or critical indigenous studies, we'll reference a lot of these federal Indian laws, right, that shape what we can do or limit what we can do, but we're not talking about like the development practices or the development policies that the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Department of Interior were also simultaneously implementing to get us to move in a certain direction. So we have, in the legislations that are, sorry about that, the legislations that are important are starting in the 1930s during the New Deal era. And that the Indian Reorganization Act creates the tribal government system that we know today. It creates the tribal governments as the governments for the reservation lands, and then only 4 years later does the Congress pass Indian Mineral Leasing Act that gives Indian nations the template for how they sign leases with coal companies, with oil companies, with gas and uranium companies to use the resources that are found in their lands, like that we saw in the map overlays. And so those are things that are simultaneously happening at the same time. So you create a government, and then you create the leasing mechanisms. And then these subsequent developments just amplify those initial legislations. And they've only been giving more and more authorities until we get to the point with the Trump photo where, let me just get through this, where you have Indian nations coming to the table asking for more authorities in order to continue to use the tribal government as a vehicle to get coal development or oil or natural gas or other kinds of extractive resources. And so that's kind of the historical, political, social conditioning necessary to get to this point, to answer that initial query as to why tribes are here interfacing with Trump, who's the most anti-Indian president in recent memory. And so, this is part of the explanation. And this explains how we think about sovereignty, a certain kind of sovereignty that's being practiced within the Navajo Nation. And I think one of the things that is important to understand when you're thinking about indigenous nations, too, and this is a methodological point, is that, oh, sorry, I went too far, is that we're not all like thinking the same thing at the same time. And, this seems like an obvious point, but in fact, we have different kinds of political, social positioning on a question, just like any other nation, just like any other community. And so for me, methodologically, when I was doing my research, and what I think is important to convey again today, is that you have to think about the different kinds of actors, what are their roles, what are their ideologies on these questions, and then that gives you a fuller, more balanced accounting of what you see happening amongst indigenous communities and indigenous nations. And so for me to do this, I triangulated the kinds of information I was getting. Maybe this is not the perfect approach, but this is one that I think gave me different kinds of perspective on this question of coal development. in the Navajo Nation, and that was to talk to environmental activists, tribal actors whose perspective I showed a lot here, and then Navajo coal workers whose perspective I'll finish the presentation with. That just gives you a sense of what I looked at. Let's look at the tribal official and how they're thinking about these things. Aside from the legal, political realities around them, which I just showed you, there's also an ideology that's formed with the way in which their governance has been structured. A lot of it that was diffused or brought in by BIA agents, by regional officers, by paternalism of non-native people that would come and talk down on tribal people and say that, you know, you're dumb and you don't know what you're doing, so you follow what we're saying. Do a Robert's Rules of Order because that's the most efficient, effective way of solving problems. That's what they would tell us, and we already had our systems of dispute resolution. But within the Navajo Nation Council, to exemplify this, we're surrounded by a mural that is like playing into this progress narrative that the federal government wants us to believe. And as you can see on the left-hand side, we have like the intervention, the colonial interventions by white settlers coming in from the east, especially after the 1880s when the railroad comes through, and the kinds of technologies and progress that they're bringing to the Navajo Nation, to the point where they're like bringing monoculture agriculture, modern husbandry techniques, and then to this point where you get Indian people who look like me with short hair, wearing ties, and holding a degree. So I'm represented on this mural. But no, that's kind of that's the logic that the tribal officials are immersed in when they're deciding on these things, when they're deciding on coal leases, oil leases, and water rights negotiations. Another incentive is the total revenues, and this was something that I compiled independently from existing reports in the Navajo Nation. But in 2013, when I was doing my research and before coal shut down, it was giving 24% of monies to non-federal monies to the Navajo Nation government. Oil, natural gas, another 22%. So it's almost half of the non-federal budget that the Navajo Nation has to work with. And what do these resources do? They pay for jobs in the tribal government. They pay for road maintenance. They pay for firewood for people who are in remote places who don't have heating. One of the paradoxes of the Navajo Nation is that you have a lot of homes that don't have electricity, that are sitting under large transmission lines, taking energy out to Phoenix and into Las Vegas and going over the Hogans, but not providing energy to the Hogans. And so we have to get money from coal and other kinds of resource extraction in order to supplement that, in order to bring these kinds of things to people who are in need. And so that's part of the way that the Navajo Nation tribal officials think about this. It's not just about colonization or buying the Republican line on these things. It's about meeting needs and what you can get with the resources that you have. And a good example of this was former President Begay saying that, even though he ran on an environmental platform when he was running for president, that he's trying to keep the Navajo Generating Station, he's trying to keep the Navajo Nation in a coal economy as long as he can in order to stave off some of the worst economic impacts that might befall the Navajo Nation if the power plant closes, which it will close, which it has closed at the end of last year. Another perspective that I think is important that's underappreciated in Indian country is that of the people who work in these industries. And in this case, I looked at the Navajo coal worker and how they were thinking about themselves and the work that they were doing. And in my interviews, when I was going out and talking to them and saying, well, why do you participate in this industry if we know that it's doing all of these things and it supports Arizona in this way and we're being exploited in the manner that I just tried to illustrate. And one of my informants or interlocutor, however you call it these days, one of the people I was talking to, I'll put it that way, said, we are practicing what our great-grandmas and great-grandpas said, ego, which is a phrase, it's a political phrase in the Navajo Nation. It's going to be up to you to be something. We are doing what we are told. ego. Get up in the morning and make some money, good things will come. So as you can see in this quote, the way in which they were thinking about the industry was about like fulfilling livelihood by being on the land and by bringing some money and some resources to like different kind of resources, some monies and cash and things that people need to their family members. And so I was saying that this resembles our kinship practices, our kinship practices that people are saying are gone because of development, but in fact have just been refitted into these kinds of industries. And by what I mean by that is like this idea of Ahuachet Ego has this historical reference, right? It's saying what our great-grandpas and great-grandmothers are doing. And there's other examples of this that I write about, but is talking about, it's coming out of this relationship that we have with the land that's based in subsistence, right? It's a subsistence ethic, and it's talking about how we have to work hard to survive on the land in the Colorado Plateau where the Navajo Nation is located. And it requires, hard work. There's not rain coming down all the time like it is outside right now. You have to find your water resources. You have to find places to graze sheep. You have to get up in the morning, take care of them. There's a lot of work to be done. But when these economies were displaced through colonization, through livestock reduction in the 1930s and a number of other policies I don't have time to go into, then, with the transition into coal, those papers that I was showing you in the Navajo Times, when they were building these industries and development, that kind of thinking wasn't displaced. It was refit into a different kind of relationship with the land, one that's fundamentally exploitative and extractive, but also is still using this idea that we're here to maintain a living and maintain a livelihood, even if we're changing the way the landscape looks. And I have this is a former Black Mesa mine that's being reclaimed right now, that's sitting fallow so that new vegetation can grow. But you can see, I don't know if you can see, but I can see it. It's really disrupted the naturalness of that part of the world, that part of the landscape. And so it looks a lot different than it did before mining happened. So there is a change in the landscape that's being done because of this. And anyway, so what I was saying is that the coal workers are in their participation in the industry, the way in which they participate in it, they are they're migrating that concept into this new way of thinking about labor and law, and not law and labor, about their livelihood. And then finally, the environmental organizers and activists, some of my wife and my friend Marley know the artists who put this mural together. This is actually happening in Phoenix, and this is showing a different kind of ideology at work. This is showing how people are trying to reclaim more of a subsistence base and more of a holistic idea of how to work with the environment. And instead of having that progress narrative on the mural, they're having it kind of centered around Mother Earth in this case, and putting like negative relationships with the land on one side and a positive relationship with the land on the other. And so on the left-hand side, you see represented in art exactly that whole narrative that I was telling you about, with the cap, with coal, and with development and underdevelopment within the Navajo Nation. And that's, this is NGS, this is Phoenix, this is a Central Arizona project, and this is the water, our local water sources being used in order to move coal from, at one instance, we were using aquifer water to slurry coal to a power plant for more than 30 years. And so it's depleting local water sources, putting environmental damage on Navajo land for the benefit of Phoenix, Scottsdale, the Phoenix metropolitan area, in a wasteful use, right? That's why you have golf courses in the foreground. It's a non-sustainable use. It's for superficial things. Whereas on the other hand, you have where the woman is doing the blessing, you have a traditional economy with sheep, like I was mentioning before, interspersed with these ideas of green technologies in the background, solar and wind and then traditional agriculture, as opposed to the monoculture that was in the previous mural, traditional Indian corn, squash, and pumpkins. And so it's trying to say, like, we can live in a more sustainable way, even incorporating these new energy technologies to try to say how we can get there and getting out of that system. So you had to, like, I had to do all of that background work in order for you to understand what's being said in this mural. So, I mean, it's a mural with a lot to say. This is a table that I created to exemplify some of the proposals that have developed in recent years about energy transition, about moving towards green technologies and other kinds of sustainable technologies that have occurred in the Navajo Nation. These are local Navajo initiatives, not things that you're hearing outside of the Navajo Nation. But, you know, obviously there have some downsides to it, and they are changing some of the governing practices within the Navajo Nation. So getting back to the main points that I was emphasizing is that infrastructures, as we saw with CAP, with NGS, they ensnare indigenous homelands into these colonial logics, prioritizing resource exploitation. And energy infrastructures become these entanglements. We become bound to them, to the production of certain kinds of energies or the materials for energies, like in the case of coal, and that limits what we can do. And we're already limited by federal Indian law, by the ways in which colonization has played out in the last 150 years. And finally, indigenous environmental groups and organizations, they're thinking past these limitations and trying to imagine new forms of livelihood and new forms of ways of dealing with these colonial entanglements, but they're not perfect. They're hard to address. And so there's plenty of critique to go around about what these proposals are asking for, but the point is that at least we're thinking about them, and we're trying to move beyond these limitations. So what is the significance that we're getting at? That indigenous nations are adversely impacted by extractive industries and by energy transition. Environmental groups are changing how we're thinking about these things. Like I said, with the mural, these are fundamentally different from the ideologies of progress that were part of the BIA system, part of even the way that the Bureau of Indian Education was teaching Indian children for many years. Like, these things are fundamentally challenging the bases of these, and they're new. And so we don't know what their long-term impact are going to be. And finally, when we're thinking about what IPCC is asking, when we're thinking about, like, this larger discourse of climate change, especially when we're saying, what is about rapid, far-reaching, unprecedented changes in all aspects of society? Well, we have to really consider what society looks like. You know, these are places that are colonized that are still under colonial relations. And if you're talking about doing a rapid and unprecedented changes, that has as much potential to harm indigenous nations as it is to help them. And it depends on how that's done. So we can't just talk about climate change and ignore colonialism. And in the end, when we're talking about what is a resource curse, the resource curse is actually a colonial curse. It's a curse of being colonized, and that's why we're in the state that we are. But there is hope in the proposals and in the imaginations of younger indigenous people who are advocating against these things today. So thank you very much, and I'll take the remainder of my time for questions.
Hi, I'm Betsy Albright, Nicholas School of the Environment. Can you all hear me? First, thank you very much. Really fascinating, engaging work. And I was really interested and caught by your discussions of infrastructures and thinking of it, and then the mural. And one of the points you mentioned is that the Navajo Nation wasn't getting energy from the coal, that it was going to others, to whites. How does that resonate with the renewables? Is that also, would the renewables serve the Navajo Nation? Do they have would they have a voice in that, or would that also be hooked to the transmission line and exported out of the nation?
I try to address it in one of these papers that I wrote about a failed green future, and it is a critique. Like I was saying, there is room for critique. So one of the, I'll just rephrase what one of the environmental organizers I interviewed said. And she said, well, it's not going to work if we just replicate the kinds of relationships we had with coal. Like we can't just like replace the technology and have the same kind of relationship. Like unless we're fundamentally changing how we're thinking about energy production and consumption, unless we're like using it for our own needs and not just selling it for export, then we're going to be in the same situation. And I tend to agree with that. And that's why I'm saying like it would become another entanglement, right? If we were tied to solar and then something else replaces it. We don't know what the future holds, right? So we think that that's going to be the end all for it, but we know that that's not, our projections in the past have been wrong. So if we do the same thing again, are we not setting ourselves up for the same kind of scenario? So yeah, that's an important question. And we're still thinking through that because we have limited options, right? Transmission lines are expensive. A lot of these things require federal funding. Federal government doesn't give us money for free. Even like they require us to concede to things. Like I was saying with the casinos and the water rights, that's the same with land rights. That's the same with any kind of thing we do. There's always a concession involved. Any kind of money we get, we need to concede something. So they use that as a leverage, and that is a part of the contemporary way colonialism is manifesting across Indian country today. When I started doing my research, when I was starting this project, I would say in 2007, when I was in Navajo Nation, we were looking at Desert Rock Power Plant and other kinds of coal initiatives at the time. There were certain key groups that were in place and that were influential in the discussion. The NACARE, Citizens Against Ruining Our Environment, Black Mesa Water Coalition, you may or may not have heard of these organizations. And they were modeled off of other environmental groups at the time, mid-2000s. And they followed that kind of organizing model. In fact, they had communication with some of these things. Sometimes they got funding from the Sierra Club, other kinds of larger national environmental groups. But that today, there's a different tone. And I don't know it as well because I've been at UNC, and that's taken me away from participating in a lot of what's going on. But there's more of a critical dynamic. There's like the Red Nation. Marley is a participant and a member of, and they're thinking, and they're actually writing a manifesto or about like a Red New Deal. So you can Google Red New Deal, and they'll give you a much more critical perspective of all these things, thinking about like fundamentally you can't do, like saying some of the same things that I'm saying here, like you can't do a Green New Deal if you're not addressing some of these other issues, these other colonial structures that are still in place. And so that is a different kind of tone, and it's not really putting a proposal together, but it's also putting a critique that's necessary. So those two are both are necessary, in my opinion, and this is my opinion, both are useful, but they're different. They're different kinds of approaches. And you see that within any like organizing community. You have people who are much more radical and people who are much more pragmatic. And so what is needed at any given time is dependent on your preference or what you think, your own politics. So that also exists within our environmental groups and in our environmental questions. So it's very robust. Yeah.
There's so many wonderful things that you brought together here, but could you say just a little bit more about the water, and not to go into all the stuff you've published, but where does the nation fall within the upper and lower reaches, and that part, but then maybe I misunderstood you, that part of what the water was doing was not just moving the coal through the slurry, but also moving water from the Colorado to Phoenix. I'm just curious about all the different kinds of hydrological cycling that
Yeah.
And then also,
that's right. You work on water.
Well, I'm
Yeah.
learning to, so this is great.
Yeah.
But so also, I know the aquifer. There's been a lot of springs that are drying up. In terms of trying to maybe move back to another kind of relation to the churro sheep, but then maybe the world has been so changed by the water extraction. I'm just wanting you to say a little more about it.
I mean, yeah, you can make an ontological argument saying that we had a sense of what water was. To'e'ina, I think, is what some people write, that the water is life. We were saying that a long time ago, and you've heard that also said again in at the Standing Rock demonstration. So that's one way of understanding water, going back to our way of our own historical way of governing. Having an indigenous governance over resources, or even resources itself, I think is questionable terminology. But anyway, I'm using it for reference for us to understand. But when you're thinking about Western water law, it just messes all of that up, and then things become complex. So surface water is different from aquifer water. Certain kinds of water systems have more importance than others. The Colorado River is the most important. It's a perennial water source. Surface water is divided up by all of these powerful political entities like California, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico. And I think I mentioned Arizona, where indigenous nations are within both the upper and lower basin. The Navajo Nation is split. You see where this split is? This leaves ferry. So like half of the nation is in the upper basin, half of the nation is the lower basin. We didn't do that. These state representatives in Santa Fe did this in 1922. And so when we're settling water like the San Juan River, which is our only water settlement, we settled in 2005, that was considered upper basin water. The Little Colorado River, which was a settlement proposed in 2012, that was lower basin water. The Colorado River is both lower and upper. We have upper basin rights and lower basin rights. So when the Colorado Compact gives Arizona 50,000 acre feet of upper basin water just by this narrow area north of Lee's Ferry to the Utah border, but that's all along the Navajo Nation. So we ought to have claims of that, but Page, the city of Page has taken it. SRP will likely contest it and the Salt River Project, they'll try to bring it down. This is my guess, is they'll try to bring it down to Phoenix for more water use because Arizona has secondary rights to California. In order for CAP to get built, Arizona had to sacrifice who gets water first, coming down the lower basin water. And California said, we'll only fund it in Congress if you give us senior rights. And so with climate change, likely we're going to see, less and less resources of water. Who's going to ultimately be the people not getting water? Indian nations, because California will get theirs, then Arizona, maybe Indian nations will get some, and only for limited purposes. There's always a constraint on it. All of these other communities can sell water rights where we can't do that. Not to say that I think selling water rights is good, but like they already put these kinds of conditions around our settlement, even when we conform to their logic of water quantification. So it's like colonialism built on colonialism built on colonialism. So like there's new ways of doing it every time. Old wine, new bottles, is that the phrase? Or is it new wine, old bottles? I don't know.
But then, of course, it's native peoples on the Mexico side, and the Colorado doesn't reach Mexico anymore.
Right. And then the Colorado River getting to Mexico and all of that drying up. And yeah, that's also I was writing about this recently. I was saying, why don't we just get rid of this whole water quantification scheme? Like it seems like the most environmentally disastrous kind of law you can have. And now that we know what it's doing, let's just get rid of it. I told this to I asked this question to our senior water rights attorney at the time, and he just kind of laughed at it. Not because he was thinking it's a stupid question, but it was also like, this is an impossible question. It's like, he said, so much law, so much has been built off of that. Any kind of diversion, any kind of settlement, any kind of community that's claiming rights. A lot of these Mormon communities up in the White Mountains, they have dams, they have diversions. They're using that water law. All of that would have to be uprooted if you get rid of that system. And so it takes a real political effort to do that. And I don't know what kind of conditions would be required. If it had to be like Mad Max conditions, then we might consider it. But I don't know what's going to happen to get people to really question the water right regime in the West.
Perhaps you have seen a film called China.
Right. I've seen that one too. It didn't end up nicely for people in it, right? Other questions? Sorry.
Is this on? Dr. Curley, thank you so much for visiting with us and sharing your insights. My name is Will Niver. I'm a research analyst here with the Energy Initiative at Duke. And my question has two parts, but it boils down to what comes next for the hundreds of Navajo and Hopi coal miners at Kayenta and who worked at Navajo Generating Station. Mm-hmm. Are there employment opportunities, or do they need to relocate to Phoenix? And then I'm also really curious about Lake Powell. 2 weeks ago, Daybreak LLC just got a permit approved to build a pumped storage hydro plant at Lake Powell.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I want to thank
Yeah.
you because you've challenged me to rethink my optimism and excitement toward that project.
Yeah.
Whether
Whose water
whether
are
that
they
is-
pumping is a question.
Right,
Yeah.
right, and whether that is a sort of a green, carbon-free, promising generation going forward, or now I'm challenged to think that no, this in fact replicates and further entrenches these colonial extractive models. So
Yeah.
I'm curious if you're still in touch with the miners and coal station workers and what they're up to, and whether you have thoughts on the proposed pumped storage hydro plant.
Quickly with the miners, a lot of them, many who are retirement age retired, but they were all laid off. Only a few kept their jobs. Many of them are the non-natives who kept their jobs, while the native miners lost their jobs and have to find other kinds of work in and around the Navajo Nation. Of course, there's been people. Most of the Indian population now lives in urban places. So that was a statistical reality in 2010 with the 2010 census. So there's been a lot of people moving and living in Phoenix. I don't want to say that it's like you can think about it as if Indian people are only in Phoenix and they go back and forth a lot. It's just a way to maintain, people, to have jobs and access education. Look where I'm at right now. So I'm all the way in North Carolina. So so people are moving around, and a lot of the people do move out when they don't have work. And that was one of the rationales for keeping the plant open, keeping the mine open, is that they actually could have work near their homes, near where they lived, even though they were creating all this environmental damage and pollution. So yeah, it's a dire situation for these workers. So they've been just left unemployed, and that's what I'm saying. That's some of the costs, right? That's some of the costs of moving from coal to other kinds of energy technologies. In this case, it was natural gas, so it wasn't like they were going towards sustainable development. But with the second part of the question, this is interesting because Lake Powell, that's upper basin water, and so, like I said, there's 50, and it's meant to reserve water so that the upper basin always has enough. It's to prevent enough of it from going to the lower basin. It's kind of like a political compromise between Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and Arizona, Nevada, and California. And so, like that water. So, like I said, Arizona had 50,000 acre feet. City of Page is using about 11,000 acre feet. They've claimed as much. The Navajo generating station was using, I think it was 34,000 acre feet of that 50,000. So that's now up for grabs now that that's shut down. So is this hydro plant using that water? Is it now going to put it to use and then make the claim for it when the Navajo Nation hasn't gotten any of the Colorado upper basin, Colorado River water? We're also trying to get water. We've been trying to get the federal government to fund a construction of a western pipeline that would take water from Lachit to Tuba City to Cameron, to some of these western-based communities in the Navajo Nation. I don't know why I'm pointing at this map. This is Eastern Navajo Nation, but So we've put that forward. We actually agreed to a water settlement in 2010. It was called the Lower Basin Water Settlement, and we agreed to settle for the Colorado River and the Little Colorado River in 2010. The Navajo Nation and the Hopi tribe both agreed to it. Under the assumption that the federal government would fund a pipeline that would take water to the Hopi Nation and also to the western part of the Navajo Nation and bring water to these communities that don't have running water. And the person who stripped that project and vetoed the legislation was former Arizona Senator Kyle. So Kyle, who's now he has a school at ASU named after him or something. These people become celebrated as statesmen, but they are anti-Indian and they're challenging. And he's done more than most in challenging water getting to the Navajo Nation. He's really done harm to getting water, and so I like to say his name as much as possible as somebody who's worked to prevent poor Navajo people in the reservation without running water from getting water. And he pretends that he's a champion of Indian interests. So if you ever see Kyle, you can ask him about that. Anyway, so that's the story of that.
I'm Steve Anderson with the Forest History Society here in Durham. Thank you again for your insights here. I'm wondering if we can move away for the moment from the specifics, working within the system. What would you imagine as being a new relationship between the federal government and the tribes that would serve the tribes and also provide for any fiduciary responsibility government may still have or demand, or however you see it?
There are quick answers and there are long answers to that question. The quick answer would be like, oh, just leave or give the land back, or I forget, a combination of these things. But but I think, we talk about this under the ideas of decolonization, and how do we decolonize, both as like a political project and also as a theoretical project. And some of the ideas are, how do we build these new relationships between settler communities and settler communities and indigenous communities. And I actually want to stay in the Pacifics because I think it gives us a way to think about it. And I was thinking about it specifically with Western water law. I feel like we all have a same interest to say that this system doesn't work for either the people who are living there that are non-Indian and also the Indian people, because it's creating unsustainable conditions for unsustainable living with this water rights, with the quantification scheme. And so if we can think of maybe even using the Eastern model of riparian system, where each community is entitled to a certain portion of the water if they have a connection to it, if they have some sort of historic use, like we can think about sharing. I mean, it's an easy concept. We learn it when we're young, and it seems to be hard to teach older Arizona politicians about it. But that's something that can be a model for future sustainable living in the area. And I think that we have enough people probably now in Phoenix and Tucson that aren't part of that older conservative generation of Arizonans who have this anti-Indian bias and might think about, like, what are we going to do with the planet in the next 50 years, and especially with the limited water resources in the area, and how we can guarantee its sustainability. And that one thing would be to just find the political will to challenge those Western water quantifications and come up with a new system. And that would be an easy way to do that with that specific kind of case. But there's other things to consider, if we talk about land, if we talk about other questions, it might not work out the same way. But in that case, I think that there's an easy solution. Not an easy solution, one that's easy to identify, but then hard to accomplish. Yeah. Other questions? We're done? All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for your questions.